On the morning of June 6, 1944, a 23-year-old medic named Robert Wright stepped into chest-deep water carrying nothing that could save his own life. No rifle, no pistol, no armor, just bandages, morphine, and the knowledge that the beach ahead was designed to kill him. Within minutes, he would make a decision that defied every instinct of self-preservation, a decision so irrational and so brave that even his enemies would stop firing to watch him do it again and again until his body finally broke. This is the story of the man the Germans called the Beast. The landing craft door dropped at 6:47 in the morning, and the world became noise. The MG-42 machine guns opened up immediately, their cyclic rate so fast the sound blurred into a single tearing scream, like canvas ripping across the sky. Robert Wright plunged into the cold Norman water behind 36 other men from the 1st Infantry Division, and before he reached the surf, 12 of them were already dead. The bullets hit the water in white geysers. They hit the steel ramp with sparks. They hit flesh with sounds that Wright would never forget and could never describe. He pushed forward because stopping meant drowning under the weight of his gear. He pushed forward because the men in front of him were pushing forward. He pushed forward because there was nowhere else to go. Omaha Beach stretched before him like a vision of industrialized death. The sand was not gold in the early light but gray, churned and pocked and littered with obstacles the Germans had planted months before. Wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, Belgian gates strung with mines. Bodies floated in the surf. Bodies lay twisted between the obstacles. The beach sloped upward toward a seawall 200 yards away, and beyond that seawall rose bluffs honeycombed with fortified positions, each one sited with overlapping fields of fire that turned the entire beach into a killing ground with no dead space, no cover, no mercy. Wright made it to the sand and threw himself behind a steel hedgehog. Mortar rounds were falling now, adding their percussion to the constant stutter of machine gun fire. The sound was so loud it stopped being sound and became pressure, a physical force that made thinking difficult and breathing shallow. Men were screaming. Some were calling for medics. Some were calling for their mothers. Some were not calling for anything anymore. Wright had trained for this. He had studied field medicine and trauma care. He had practiced bandaging techniques and learned how to spot arterial bleeding and memorized the symptoms of shock. But nothing had prepared him for the totality of it. The sheer volume of suffering concentrated into a few hundred yards of French coastline. He moved. That was what medics did. They moved toward the screaming when everyone else was trying to get away from it. Wright crawled from the hedgehog to a wooden obstacle where a young private lay clutching his abdomen, blood pooling beneath him in the sand. The boy's eyes were wide and terrified and searching Wright's face for some indication that this was fixable, that he was not about to die on a beach whose name he did not know in a country he had never wanted to visit. Wright opened his aid bag and worked quickly. Sulfa powder into the wound. Pressure bandage. Morphine syringe into the thigh, and then the empty tube pinned to the boy's collar so no one would dose him again and stop his heart. Wright marked him with an M in grease pencil on the forehead. Morphine administered. Someone else's problem now. He moved to the next man, then the next. The beach was a triage nightmare. Men with sucking chest wounds. Men with legs blown off below the knee. Men with abdominal trauma that no field medic could address. Men whose insides were on the outside. Men who were alive but would not be in an hour no matter what Wright did. He made decisions. Tourniquet here. Pressure there. Morphine for this one because he was dying and deserved not to die in agony. Nothing for that one because he was already dead and just did not know it yet. Wright's hands were red to the wrists. His uniform was soaked through, though he could not tell if it was seawater or blood or both. The minefield lay between the waterline and the seawall. It was not marked. It was not regular. The Germans had planted the mines in irregular patterns specifically to confuse engineers and slow any advance. Some were teller mines designed to destroy vehicles. Others were S-mines, shrapnel minen, which the Americans called bouncing bettas because they leaped into the air before detonating and sent ball bearings through everything in a 10-meter radius. The engineers were supposed to clear the mines. They had detectors. They had training. They had not made it off the beach yet because most of them were dead or pinned down or trying not to become dead. Wright saw Private Kowalski behind a steel obstacle 40 yards away. Kowalski had taken a round through the pelvis and was losing blood fast, too fast, and he was screaming in a way that indicated he knew what was happening to him. Between Wright and Kowalski lay the minefield. Wright knew it was there. Everyone knew it was there. The rational decision was to wait for the engineers to clear a path. The rational decision was to let Kowalski bleed out because one life was not worth 2 lives. And stepping into an unmarked minefield carrying a wounded man was suicide with extra steps. Wright stood up and started walking. He did not run. Running would mean missteps, and missteps would mean detonation. He walked carefully, scanning the sand for disturbances, for the telltale mounding or the faint outline of a pressure plate. Kowalski was not a small man, and the weight made Wright's boots sink deeper with every step. Somewhere above the beach, a German sniper watched him through a scope. The range was less than 200 meters, an easy shot, but the sniper did not fire. Not yet. Perhaps he was curious. Perhaps he thought Wright would step on a mine and save him a bullet. Perhaps, though Wright would not learn this until much later, the sniper recognized the red cross on Wright's helmet and arm, recognized what Wright was attempting, and felt something that stayed his finger on the trigger just long enough for Wright to take another step. He was halfway across when the sniper fired. The round hit Wright in the left shoulder, entering just above the collarbone and exiting through the scapula without hitting anything immediately vital but causing enough damage that his left arm went partially numb and he nearly dropped Kowalski. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot spike driven through muscle and bone, but Wright did not fall. He adjusted his grip, leaned forward to compensate for the weight distribution, and kept walking. Blood ran down his chest beneath his uniform. He could feel it, warm and wet and spreading. Another round cracked past his head close enough that he felt the displacement of air. Then another. The sniper was firing regularly now, but Wright was moving and the range was changing, and Kowalski's body made targeting difficult. Wright reached the seawall. He laid Kowalski down beside 3 other wounded men who had made it that far and were now waiting for evacuation that might never come. Kowalski grabbed Wright's sleeve, trying to say something, but Wright pulled away and started back across the minefield. He had memorized the path on the way in, every step, every safe piece of sand. He trusted his memory because there was nothing else to trust. The second trip was for Henderson. Shrapnel wounds across the back and legs, perforated intestine, shock setting in. Wright found him tangled in barbed wire near a destroyed Higgins boat, cut him loose with a knife, and carried him in a fireman's carry across the same path he had just walked. A mortar round landed 15 feet to his right and showered him with sand and shrapnel fragments, but none of the fragments found flesh and he kept moving. Henderson was unconscious by the time they reached the seawall. Wright laid him down, checked his breathing, and went back. The third trip was for Miller. Compound fracture of the femur, the bone visible through torn muscle, blood loss severe. Miller was a radio man and his equipment was still strapped to his back, adding another 40 pounds to the carry. Wright took him anyway. By now the sniper had stopped firing at him. The machine guns were still sweeping the beach, still cutting down men as they emerged from the water, but they were not firing at Wright. Not anymore. Later, much later, after the war had ended and the reports had been compiled and the witnesses had been interviewed, a German after-action report would surface. It described an American medic who crossed a minefield 8 times under fire, carrying wounded men to safety. The report used the word Tiermut, animal courage, courage beyond reason. Courage that belonged to something other than a thinking man, who understood risk and probability and death. Wright did not feel courageous. He felt tired. His shoulder wound was bleeding steadily, soaking through the bandage he had tied around it with his teeth and one hand. His legs were shaking from exertion. His medical supplies were running low. But men were still screaming, still dying, still trapped in positions where they could not help themselves, and Wright could help them. That was the only thought that made sense to him in the chaos. They needed help. He could help. Therefore he would help. The 4th trip, the 5th, the 6th. Each time he crossed the minefield, his memory of the safe path became more certain. He could walk it with his eyes closed now, his boots finding the exact spots where no mine waited beneath the sand. Other men started watching him. Some of the wounded tried to crawl toward the path he was using, but Wright waved them back because even a few inches off the route could mean death, and he could not remember where every mine was, only where they were not. The engineers were moving up the beach now, and they watched too, unable to believe what they were seeing, unwilling to follow until they could sweep the route properly. But Wright did not wait for them. By the 7th trip, Wright could no longer fully use his right arm. A shell fragment had caught him across the tricep, not deep enough to sever anything critical but deep enough that lifting had become difficult, and pain shot through the limb with every movement. He was dragging men now rather than carrying them, pulling them by their webbing, their collars, their belts, whatever he could grip with his left hand while his right arm hung partially useless at his side. He was leaving a trail of his own blood across the sand. Some of the men he saved were conscious enough to tell him to stop, to save himself, that he had done enough. Wright ignored them. Enough was when there were no more wounded within reach. Enough was when his body stopped obeying his will. Enough was not yet. The 8th trip began with a soldier named Patterson, who had taken shrapnel through both legs and was pinned beneath a destroyed Bangalore torpedo that had failed to detonate. Wright reached him, shifted the torpedo carefully, and hauled Patterson up into a modified carry that put most of the weight on Wright's left side. His vision was narrowing. Blood loss and shock were catching up to him. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, each step requiring conscious thought where before his body had simply known what to do. He was 20 meters from the seawall when his boot came down on the S-Mine. The pressure plate clicked. It was a small sound, barely audible over the ambient noise of battle, but Wright heard it clearly and knew exactly what it meant. He had perhaps half a second before the primary charge launched the mine into the air. He tried to throw Patterson clear. Whether he succeeded, he would never know for certain. The mine lifted, rising to waist height before the secondary charge detonated and sent 700 steel balls radiating outward at supersonic velocity. Wright felt himself come apart. There was no other way to describe it. The ball bearings shredded his legs, his abdomen, his chest. He went down hard, and the sand beneath him turned dark immediately. The pain was immense and then suddenly distant, his nervous system overloading and shutting down whole sectors of sensation to protect what remained of his consciousness. He knew he was dying. The knowledge was clear and strangely calm. He had seen enough men die to recognize the process in himself. He did not call for help. What would be the point? Any medic who came for him would be crossing a minefield to retrieve a man who was already functionally dead. That was not triage. That was sentiment. Wright had no use for sentiment. He lay in the sand and felt his heartbeat slow. The sky above him was gray with smoke and clouds. Somewhere nearby, men were still fighting. Somewhere ships were firing salvos at the bluffs. Somewhere the war was continuing without him. He thought about Paducah, Kentucky. He thought about streets he had walked and people he had known, and a life that now seemed impossibly distant and impossibly simple. He did not think about the men he had saved. He did not frame his actions in heroic terms. He had done what needed doing, that was all. The two engineers came anyway. They were Corporal Davies and Private First Class Murray, and they had been watching Wright for the past 40 minutes with a combination of awe and horror. When they saw him go down, they did not discuss it. They did not debate the risks. Davies grabbed a mine detector, Murray grabbed a litter, and they started into the field. They moved slowly, sweeping every foot of ground, marking safe spots with white tape. Other men shouted at them to stop, to wait for support, to not throw their lives away on a corpse. Davies and Murray ignored them. They reached Wright in 8 minutes, which felt like hours, and found him still breathing, though barely. The blood loss was catastrophic. His legs were ruined. His abdomen was opened in multiple places, but his eyes were open and aware, and when Davies leaned over him, Wright tried to speak. The words came out as a wet whisper, unintelligible, but Davies nodded as if he understood. They loaded him onto the litter and carried him back along the taped path. Every step was careful. Every step was deliberate. One mistake and all 3 of them would die. They reached the seawall and passed Wright to a medical team that had just come ashore. The team looked at Wright and looked at each other with expressions that said this man should already be dead. But they worked on him anyway, because that was what medics did. They stabilized him enough for transport to a landing craft, and the landing craft took him to the USS Texas, where surgeons worked on him for 11 hours straight, removing shrapnel, repairing what could be repaired, amputating what could not. Wright survived. Against all probability and all reasonable medical expectation, he survived. He underwent 6 more surgeries over the following 3 months. He lost his right leg below the knee. He lost full function in his left arm. He spent a year in recovery, learning to walk again with a prosthetic, learning to live in a body that no longer worked the way it once had. The pain was constant. The phantom sensations were worse, but he was alive. In August 1945, 2 months after the war in Europe ended, President Harry Truman presented Robert Wright with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." The citation detailed the 8 trips across the minefield. It mentioned the wounds he sustained. It noted that his actions directly resulted in the survival of 12 men who would otherwise have died on the beach. It did not mention that Wright had nightmares every night. It did not mention that he woke up screaming. It did not mention that he could still hear the MG-42s in quiet moments, that tearing canvas sound that lived in his head forever. Wright returned to Paducah in September 1945. He moved back into his childhood home. He took a job at the post office. He married a woman named Eleanor who had known him since grade school and who did not ask him about the war. They had 2 daughters. He attended church on Sundays. He coached Little League baseball for a few years until his leg made it too difficult. He lived quietly. When people asked about Omaha Beach, which they rarely did after the first few years, he said only that the men needed help and he could help them. That was the extent of his explanation. He did not describe the minefield. He did not talk about the pain. He did not frame himself as heroic. He had done a job that needed doing, and he had survived, and now he was home. In 1962, a German veteran named Klaus Richter published a memoir about his experiences in the 352nd Infantry Division, which had defended Omaha Beach. Richter had been an observer in one of the fortified positions above the beach, and he wrote about the American medic he and his comrades had watched that morning. They had called him Dos Dare, Richter wrote, the Beast. Not as an insult, but as an acknowledgement of something they had never seen before, and would never see again. A man who moved through death as if death had no claim on him. A man who refused every natural instinct toward self-preservation in service of others. Richter wrote that he had given the order to cease fire on the medic after the third trip, though not all of his men had obeyed. He wrote that he had expected the medic to die every time he crossed the field. He wrote that, when the mine finally took him down, Richter had felt something close to grief. In 1967, a team of Army engineers returned to Omaha Beach as part of a historical documentation project. They brought mine detectors and excavation equipment. They swept the area where Wright had made his crossings and found the mines that remained. There were 2,741 of them, spread across a section of beach roughly 80 yards wide and 50 yards deep. The safe path Wright had used, the path he had memorized and walked 8 times while wounded and under fire, was never more than 18 inches wide at any point. In some places it was less than 12 inches. One misstep, one moment of lost concentration, one alteration of his stride would have killed him instantly. The engineers mapped the entire field and could not determine how he had done it. The pattern was too irregular. The spacing was too inconsistent. By all probability and logic, Wright should have died on the first trip. Wright himself had no explanation. When interviewed for the project, he said he had simply watched where he stepped. He did not remember being scared. He did not remember thinking about the mines. He remembered the weight of the men he carried and the need to keep moving and the texture of the sand under his boots. That was all. Robert Wright died in 1998 at the age of 77. The funeral was small. His wife had passed 2 years prior. His daughters were there, and his grandchildren, and a few dozen people from town. A representative from the Department of Defense attended and presented the family with a flag. A local VFW chapter sent an honor guard. The Presbyterian minister who conducted the service had known Wright for 30 years and spoke about his kindness, his quiet humor, his dedication to his family. The minister did not mention Omaha Beach. That had been Wright's wish. He did not want the war to be the summation of his life. He had lived 53 years after that morning in Normandy, and those years mattered as much as the hours he had spent crossing a minefield. He had been a husband, a father, a grandfather, a postal worker. A man who liked fishing and baseball and sitting on his porch in the evenings. The war was one day. The rest was a lifetime. But on June 6, 1944, Robert Wright made a choice that defied every reasonable impulse. He saw men dying and decided that saving them was worth his own death. He crossed a minefield 8 times not because he was ordered to, not because he thought he would survive, but because it was the right thing to do and he was capable of doing it. 12 men lived because of that choice. 12 men went home to families, to futures, to lives that would not have existed if Wright had made the rational decision and stayed behind cover. The cost was his body, his health, and decades of pain. The cost was nightmares and phantom limbs and the weight of memory. Whether that trade was worth it is not for anyone else to judge. Wright made the trade. He lived with the consequences. He never complained. That is the story of Corporal Robert Wright, the medic the Germans called the Beast, the man who walked through a minefield because someone had to and no one else would. His courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite fear, despite pain, despite the absolute certainty of his own destruction. That kind of courage is rare. It cannot be taught. It cannot be commanded. It can only be witnessed and remembered. And now you know his name. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what courage really means, then subscribe to this channel and like this video so others can hear it too. And leave a comment below. If you were in Wright's position with men dying around you and a minefield between you and safety, what would you have done? Would you have crossed? Would you have waited? There is no wrong answer. There is only honesty. Thank you for listening.